One aspect of the Second World War emphasized its totality above any other. This was strategic bombing, especially the German campaign against Britain, the Anglo-US bombing of Germany, and the American air offensive against mainland Japan. These bombing campaigns put the civilian in the firing line to an extent that had never been experienced in previous wars. The morality of this has been a subject of often bitter debate ever since. But those in charge of these strategic air offensives were convinced that the pre-war air theorists were right when they preached that the bomber was the war winner of the future. They believed that it could shorten the war and would save casualties to their own side by making costly ground campaigns superfluous. Yet at the outbreak of war in September 1939, the air forces of both sides were restricted to attacking strictly military targets. This also meant bombing by day, since the bombers lacked the means to identify targets accurately by night. The Germans had three medium bomber types: the Dornier Do-17, known to the Allies as the Flying Pencil, the Junkers Ju-88, which was designed as a dive bomber and had a high degree of maneuverability. Like the other German bombers, it could carry some 5,000 pounds of bombs. And the Heinkel HE-111. This had a four-man crew, a top speed of 240 miles per hour, and a range of just under 1,100 miles. It was these bombers which first strayed from the military targets-only policy, when they attacked Warsaw during the overrunning of Poland. But this was only after the Poles had refused to surrender the city and had declared that they would defend it to the last. During the phony war in the West that followed the Polish campaign, both sides continued to restrict themselves to military targets. Indeed, the only British operations over the interior of Germany were the dropping of leaflets by night. This was carried out by Whitley bombers. The British concentrated their attacks on German naval installations, but these were costly. The bombers on their own proved too vulnerable to the German anti-aircraft fire and fighters. Consequently, early in 1940, the RAF turned to attacks by night, but this presented a severe challenge to the bomber navigators. There were only two navigation methods which could be used. One was called dead reckoning, which meant comparing estimated wind speed and direction with the airspeed of the aircraft.
Hello, Skipper. The target's about 50 miles upriver. I suggest we make a sweep and approach it down the river. We'll see the canal better then. Over to you.
Okay.
The other was astronavigation, which meant taking fixes on the stars. But it took time to work out the aircraft's position from these, and meanwhile it continued to fly on. Thus neither method was very accurate, and most crews relied on identifying landmarks like rivers to work out where they were. May 1940 saw the Luftwaffe attack Rotterdam, when the Dutch hesitated over surrendering the port. When they did, the bombers were already on their way, and an order to abort the mission did not get through to them. Consequently, much of Rotterdam was devastated. In contrast, the French declared Paris an open city. Not a bomb was dropped on it, and German troops entered the French capital without a shot being fired. After the fall of France, Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe turned on Britain. The role of the bombers was to help achieve air superiority over southern England, an essential prerequisite to the invasion of Britain. They attacked docks and aircraft factories, as well as essentially military targets like airfields. But as the British had discovered the previous year, against a determined defense, which now included radar, German bomber casualties by day, even with a fighter escort, became too heavy. Even the excellent flight performance of the HE-111 and Ju-88, which RAF pilots found when testing captured models, was not enough to ward off the British fighters. Towards the end of August 1940, the Luftwaffe therefore began to switch to night attacks. But now the problem of navigation resurfaced. On the night of the 25th of August, a German aircraft dropped bombs in error on the centre of London. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, believing that this had been intentional, ordered an attack on Berlin for the following night, with some 80 bombers taking part. Most of them were Vickers Wellingtons. While its top speed of 230 miles per hour was slower than the German HE-111, its range of nearly 1,400 miles, with a similar 5,000-pound bomb load, was significantly longer. Affectionately called the Wimpy by its crews, after a cartoon character of the day, the Wellington was a very tough aircraft, which could take a lot of punishment. The damage inflicted on Berlin was slight, but so enraged was Hitler that he now ordered attacks on British towns and cities. The first of the German attacks on British cities took place on the 7th of September 1940 and marked the beginning of what the British called the Blitz. This was the pounding of British cities night after night with the aim of cracking morale. London was struck the heaviest. Indeed, between the 7th of September and 12th of November 1940, there was only one night on which the German bombers did not attack the capital. The weapons used were high explosive bombs, delayed action mines, and incendiaries. The damage was immense. To protect themselves from the bombing, many people were forced to spend their nights on the underground railway stations. Next morning, they faced an anxious period, wondering whether they still had a home and a place of work to go to. The Germans developed sophisticated navigation aids based on radio waves. One of these, X-Gerät, X-equipment, was used on one particularly devastating raid. On the afternoon of the 14th of November 1940, German bomber bases in northern France were a hive of activity. One particular bomber group, Kampfgruppe 100, was to use the X-beams to guide it to the target, the English Midland city of Coventry. This was an important munitions production center. In particular, Coventry contained a tank factory and a major aircraft plant. Excarate had transmitters on the French coast. That at Cherbourg, codenamed Weser, was to transmit a beam directed on Coventry. From its base at Vannes, KG-100 would fly to Cherbourg and then along this beam. The Pas-de-Calais transmitters now came into play. Rhine would intersect Weser some distance from the target. This told the KG-100 crews to fly along the very center of Weser. To do this, the pilot used a simple dial. "30 kilometers from Coventry, the aircraft picked up beam Ode. The bomb aimer now started a clock. This took the aircraft's speed into account and was in effect a bomb release computer. 15 kilometers further on, the aircraft met beam Elbe. The bomb aimer pressed his clock again, and within a minute, incendiary bombs were automatically released over Coventry. The main bomber force navigated itself towards the city using conventional methods. The crews could see the fires started by KG-100's incendiaries some distance out. After that, it was easy. The heart was all but torn out of Coventry that night. A woman from outside was part of a team sent in to help next morning.
Then suddenly, as we came to the edge of the city, the air became as warm as a spring day. Though it was noon, the city was darkened by the black fog that clouded the sky and the thick banks of soot that were suspended over the streets. The people who walked the streets had grimy faces and their eyes were reddened with the heat and the smoke.
But Coventry did not die, and the factories were soon back to full production. The truth of the matter was that the Blitz united the British people as seldom before. They were all in it together, and were determined not to bend to Hitler's will, something which American journalists in Britain noticed. One, Ed Murrow of CBS, sent back a series of moving dispatches on the theme, "Britain can take it."
I remember the evening of Sunday, December 29th. It was just like any other winter evening. The first bombers were over London at about 6:30. Soon the fires hissed from the top-story windows. Hitler once boasted, "I will rub out their cities." This is what he meant.
This helped to win American sympathy for Britain. On the night of the 10th, 11th of May, 1941, London suffered one of its heaviest raids to date. Over 3,000 people were killed or injured, with 1/3 of the streets made impassable. It was Hitler's final flourish. The bomber had not brought Britain to her knees, and he was impatient to crush his arch-enemy, the Soviet Union. When the Germans invaded Russia on the 22nd of June 1941, the Luftwaffe initially fulfilled its traditional role of support of the ground offensive. The Russians, on the other hand, did send bombers to attack Berlin. Typical of the Russian bombers was the Ilyushin IL-4, with its impressive range of 2,600 miles, but small 3,000-pound bomb load. But like the early British attacks on the German capital, these were mere pinpricks. In any event, such was the speed of the German advance that dislocation of command and control systems and distance soon halted these attacks. But a fatal flaw in the makeup of the Luftwaffe's bomber arm was now to be revealed. The Russians evacuated their key war industries to east of the Urals. This presented the Germans with a dilemma. For Russian industry was now out of range of the German bombers, which were still two-engined medium-range types. The Luftwaffe lacked a true strategic bomber in sufficient quantities. Heinkel had been developing a true long-range bomber, the HE-177 Greif, but it was beset by design problems, largely brought about by the demand for high speed and a dive-bombing capability, as well as engine difficulties. Production did not get underway until 1942, and only at a low rate. In contrast to the Germans, RAF Bomber Command began to receive no less than 3 different heavy bomber types during the first half of 1941. These were the Handley Page Halifax, with a range of 1,900 miles and 13,000-pound bomb load. The 2-engine Avro Manchester. And the first to enter service, the Short Stirling. These aircraft were vital, since bombing was the only way in which the British could strike directly at Germany. This was both in the context of retaliation for the Blitz and to lift some of the intense German pressure on Russia. But RAF Bomber Command was having problems. Firstly, during 1941, target priorities kept changing, and there was a growing feeling that the bombers were not being given sufficient time to achieve significant damage on any particular type of target, whether it be oil, transportation, or specific war industries. Crews were usually convinced that they had hit the target.
Koslov, how are you getting on? Oh, quite a good trip, sir. We found the target, and we hit it with the second stick. First stick overshot a bit. We left a very good fire going.
But a study during the summer of 1941 revealed that only 1/10 of them were dropping their bombs within 10 miles of a target in Germany. It was a shattering revelation, but brought about by the lack of an effective navigation system. Also, under General Josef Kammhuber's direction, the German air defenses were growing ever stronger. Coordination of the various elements involved was increasingly effective. Radars, searchlights, and flak guns made the skies ever more dangerous for British bombers. There were, too, the night fighters. What was called the Kammhuber Line had a belt of radars to provide early warning of the bomber's approach. Behind these was a further belt of radars, searchlights and flak guns, with similar concentrations protecting the principal cities. The main industrial region of the Ruhr was also protected. But RAF Bomber Command's waning morale was boosted by 3 factors early in 1942. First was the appearance of a new heavy bomber, the Avro Lancaster. This had been developed from the Manchester, whose mechanical failures had given it a poor reputation among the crews. Capable of carrying 14,000 pounds of bombs to a target over 800 miles away, equivalent to flying from London almost to Warsaw and back, its performance far exceeded that of any other Bomber Command aircraft. A new navigation device known as G also appeared. Using ground transmitters and a specially gridded chart, the navigator could pinpoint his position within just a few seconds. But since the system operated on line of sight, its range was limited to 400 miles from Britain, which meant that it could only be used against westernmost Germany. Furthermore, like the 1940 German systems, it could be jammed. The third factor to boost RAF Bomber Command was a new chief. Known as Bert to his friends and Bomber, or Butch, by his crews, Arthur Harris was a single-minded man who firmly believed that bombing could win the war.
They sowed the wind, and now they are going to reap the whirlwind. There are a lot of people who say that bombing can never win a war. Well, my answer to that is that it has never been tried yet, and we shall see. Germany, clinging more and more desperately to her widespread conquests and even seeking foolishly for more, will make a most interesting initial experiment. Japan will provide the confirmation.
With the backing of Churchill and the Air Ministry, Harris set out to demonstrate what his command could do if it had enough heavy bombers. At the end of May, by dredging the entire resources of Bomber Command, including the training organization, Harris managed to gather over 1,000 bombers for a raid on Cologne. Heavy damage was done to this historic German city, and the success of the operation was a boost not just for Bomber Command, but Britain as a whole. Further 1,000 bomber raids were mounted against Essen and Bremen, but they could not be sustained, given the command's existing strength. Indeed, not for another 2 years would the British mount raids of such size again. The truth of the matter was that Bomber Command had to compete with other branches of the armed forces, especially Coastal Command, then grappling with the U-boat scourge in the Atlantic. Obtaining sufficient heavy bombers would take a long time. These raids against cities were known officially as area bombing and had become the cornerstone of the British bombing policy. The official rationale was to de-house workers and thereby disrupt war production. In truth, though, the aim was demoralization, as preached by the pre-war air theorists. But if RAF Bomber Command was not yet strong enough on its own to bring Germany to its knees, it was conscious that a new force was gathering to join it, the US 8th Air Force, which was beginning to form in Britain. On the 4th of July 1942, 6 RAF A-20 Boston day bombers were joined by 6 American A-20s in an attack on a Dutch airfield. This marked the first US bombing operation in Europe. But it was the mighty Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses to which the British really looked, and these made their first attacks 6 weeks later against targets in France. Once the American bombers were in strength in Britain, the bombing of Germany could really get underway. The American bomber crews arrived in Europe in the summer of 1942, convinced that in spite of the British and German experience, they could bomb effectively by day. Their grounds for this belief were threefold. Firstly, the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator had significantly heavier defensive armament than the British bombers. Thus, while the Lancaster had 8 machine guns, the B-17 could boast no less than 13, and of larger caliber, .50 inches as against .303. The American heavy bombers also flew in boxes, which were laid out to provide the best all-round defense against air attack. The crews thought the resultant massive weight of firepower would keep the bravest German fighter pilots at bay. Operating by day would make navigation easy, and the Norden bomb site was more accurate than any other of the time. But there was to be no early massive American bomber onslaught against Germany, since many bombers were diverted in late 1942 to assist in clearing the Axis forces from North Africa. The Allies agreed, however, that a combined bomber offensive was essential preparation for liberating Europe. Its aim was laid down as the progressive destruction and dislocation of the German military, industrial, and economic system, and the undermining of the morale of the German people to a point where their capacity for armed resistance is fatally weakened. This gave RAF Bomber Command carte blanche to maintain its attacks on German cities by night. The commanders of the US Army Air Force in Europe viewed the offensive in a different way. General Ira C. Aker identified 6 vital German war industries and planned to launch precision attacks against each by day. But although the 8th Air Force had begun attacking German ports, it would be some months before it had sufficient heavy bombers to mount a sustained offensive deep into Germany. In contrast, RAF Bomber Command began a campaign against the Ruhr, the main industrial region in Western Germany, in March 1943. The British bombers now had improved aids to assist bombing accuracy. One was downwards-looking radar, called H2S, or Home Sweet Home, which gave a picture of the terrain over which the bomber was flying on a radar screen. This was also taken on by the Americans as H2X, for bombing through cloud. Another radar device was codenamed Oboe. One ground station, the Cat, tracked the aircraft as it flew along an arc of constant range which passed through the target. The Mouse measured the range along and told the aircraft when to release its bombs. But the Ruhr was strongly defended, and British bomber casualties rose steadily. The German night fighters, using devices which could detect the British airborne radar transmissions, were especially active in this increasing electronic battle in the skies over Germany. RAF bomber losses rose, and eventually, in July 1943, Bomber Harris had to halt his campaign against the Ruhr. During this battle, there was, however, one spectacular operation, the attack on the Ruhr dams in May 1943. Led by Wing Commander Guy Gibson, the operation involved 19 Lancasters. They used searchlights to maintain an exact altitude of 60 feet above the water, and a primitive aiming device to tell them when to release their weapon. This was a bomb especially designed to bounce across the water. It struck the dam and then sank below the surface. At a preset depth, it detonated. 2 out of the 3 dams attacked were breached at a cost of 8 bombers. Although extensive flooding resulted, the effect on German industry was limited. Even so, the dam's raid was one of the most famous. Towards the end of July 1943, the Allied bombers turned on a new target, the German port of Hamburg. In the course of 4 British attacks by night and 2 American by day, the city was devastated, with the very hot weather creating a firestorm which could not be controlled. Some 44,000 civilians perished in Hamburg. Tens of thousands of others were made homeless. During the Hamburg attacks, the British employed a new device, window. Strips of aluminium foil cut to a specific size were dropped from the bombers. These produced a blurring effect on the German radar screens. The Germans soon learned to work through it, but the device, now called chaff, is still widely used today. In North Africa, General Louis Brereton's US 9th Air Force identified a target which lay across the Mediterranean in Romania. Its name was Ploesti. The oil fields here supplied 60% of Germany's crude oil. If they were destroyed, it could have a fatal effect on the Nazi war machine. On the 1st of August 1943, 178 B-24 Liberators took off to attack Ploesti. Matters went wrong from the start. One of the navigating aircraft spun into the sea, and its bomber group flew off course. Radio silence had to be broken to get back on track.
We missed our target run. We're not on target. 2 targets of opportunity. 2 targets of opportunity. You're on your own. You're on your own. Traffic circuit, follow us in. Traffic circuit, follow us in. Traffic circuit, follow us in.
This alerted the German air defenses. Nevertheless, the bombers flew on at very low level and struck at the target. Some B-24 Liberators fell victim to flak guns. Others were cut down by Messerschmitt Me-109 fighters as they turned for home. No less than a third of the B-24s were shot down. Many others limped home severely damaged. Nearly 500 American crewmen were killed or wounded. Ploesti itself suffered, but it was only operating at 60% capacity at the time, and oil production hardly halted. Indeed, it would take many more attacks from bombers based in Italy during 1944 to destroy the oil field. But by then, the Germans were being driven out of Romania. But the 8th Air Force also suffered a severe setback that same month of August 1943. On the morning of the 17th of August, 376 American bombers flew from England towards Germany. Their targets were the ball bearing factory at Schweinfurt, and an Me-109 fighter factory at nearby Regensburg. Some of the bombers would then fly on to North Africa, while the remainder returned to Britain.
Pilot to crew, over enemy coast. On the ball, you guys.
Once the bombers had entered Germany, their P-47 Thunderbolt escorts had to turn for home. Otherwise, they would run out of fuel. The bombers pressed on, but were subjected to wave after wave of German fighter attacks.
Okay, here they are. 9 o'clock high, enemy fighters. High.
One B-17 co-pilot recalled,
"There wasn't much sense in calling out fighters that day. Everything was 12 o'clock level for what seemed an eternity.
9 o'clock level.
Each time they came in, you thought that one of those times it would be our turn to get it.
He's going low.
So many of our planes had gone."
Smoking on number 4. You got one out of the high squadron. Yep. No chance there.
.60 bombers were shot down. A further 86 were so badly damaged that they would never fly again. The belief that the American bombers could attack deep into Germany on their own by day had been severely shaken. 2 months later, the bombers returned to Schweinfurt, and the story was the same, with another 60 bombers lost and many more damaged. The 8th Air Force thus withdrew to the fringes to await a proper long-range escort fighter. This arrived in the shape of the P-51D Mustang at the beginning of 1944. Here was an aircraft which could accompany the bombers all the way to Berlin and beyond. But the British too began to suffer that autumn of 1943. Bomber Harris had now turned his attention to the German capital itself, in the belief that its destruction could be decisive. But bad weather and strong air defenses meant an uphill battle. As an RAF navigator remembered,
"There was no glamour in this winter Battle of Berlin, and the crews got no kick out of it, apart from the fact that it was the capital of the Reich they were attacking. The trips were long, dull, and dangerous. Lining the route, we would see strings of fighter flares, generally in threes, and every now and then the gunners would report an aircraft falling in flames."
The strain on the bomber crews, both British and American, was immense. This was especially in the knowledge that only a quarter of crews, like that of B-17 Memphis Belle, would complete an operational tour. 25 missions for the Americans and 30 for the British. Of the remainder, some would be wounded by flak or the guns of the German fighters. Others would bail out of their stricken aircraft over enemy territory and be made prisoners of war. But the majority of those who fell by the wayside made the ultimate sacrifice. Some crews relied on religion to see them through. Others survived just on hope that they would see the end of their tours and enjoy a rest before entering the fray once more. All had to master one dominant emotion.
We didn't have fighter escorts to go very far. We had P-47s, but they'd only go in a short ways, and then they'd have to leave us, and then the Germans would take over, and it scared us to death.
If you've ever been going down a highway about 60, 70 miles an hour and some guy swerves over and you get that feeling through you that you're going to be hit, well, that's that feeling you have for hours at a time.
You ask about being scared? Yes, we were scared. We were damn thankful we were coming back because we lost a few of the boys there, and we felt good when we were coming across that coastline heading for England.
But some simply could not withstand the pressure and cracked. The RAF called this lack of moral fiber, which implied cowardice, and has been criticized for its inhuman treatment of these cases. But as Leonard Cheshire, Britain's most highly decorated bomber pilot, said,
I had to be ruthless with moral fiber cases. We were airmen, not psychiatrists. Of course, we had concern for any individual whose internal tensions meant he could no longer go on. But there was the worry that one really frightened man could affect the others around him. There was no time to be as compassionate as I would like to have been. I was flying too, and we had to get on with the war.
In April 1944, the pressure on Germany itself was relieved when the Allied bombing forces in Britain were switched to General Eisenhower's command in preparation for the Normandy landings. But this was not without a fight. Bomber Harris wanted to continue his city busting.
His victory. Now is not the time, in any way, to ease up, but to put on what indeed may prove, sooner perhaps than some of us think, the final spurt.
General Karl Tui Spatz, now commanding the US bomber forces, wanted to attack oil. Eisenhower had his way, however, and was much impressed by the bomber support he received. Indeed, he personally decorated Harris and Spatz with the Legion of Merit, together with Sir Trafford Lee Mallory, his air commander. In the autumn of 1944, the bombers concentrated once more on Germany, with oil the prime target. This and attacks on transportation gradually brought the German war machine to a virtual halt. But cities continued to suffer. In February 1945, British and American bombers struck at cities in eastern Germany. This was in support of the Russian offensive into the Third Reich. Among the cities hit was Dresden, which contained many historic buildings, but few war industries. Indeed, it was full of refugees from the Russian offensive. The virtual destruction of Dresden caused unease in the Allied camp. Even Winston Churchill, so long an advocate of strategic bombing, condemned it as unnecessary. He ordered Bomber Command to cease attacking centers of population on the grounds that making Germany a total wasteland would make post-war occupation of the country that much more difficult. Dresden has often been cited by those who have questioned the morality of strategic bombing. Yet at the time, the Germans were still resisting, and Dresden was but one of many cities which had been pulverized during 5 years of total war. But bombing on its own had not brought Germany to its knees. On the other hand, without the progressive destruction and dislocation of the German infrastructure brought about by the bombing, the war in Europe would have lasted considerably longer and cost many more Allied lives. The same argument was later to apply to the war against Japan. In April 1942, B-25 Mitchell bombers led by Jimmy Doolittle made the first American attack on Japan after the carrier USS Hornet had taken them within range. Yet it would be more than 2 years before Japan suffered further bombing. The reason was that even the B-17 could only reach targets 1,000 miles from its base, and not until 1945 would Allied forces be this close. However, Boeing had been developing another bomber, the massive B-29 Superfortress, which could carry twice the bomb load of the B-17, twice the distance. In the spring of 1944, B-29s were deployed to India. The idea was that they would attack Japanese targets in Southeast Asia and, using bases in non-Japanese occupied China, strike at Japan itself. Some attacks were mounted, but a Japanese offensive threatened the Chinese airfields and the bombers were forced to withdraw. That summer, the Americans secured the Marianas, some 1,300 miles south of Japan, and built airfields to take the Superfortress. The first of these landed on Saipan on the 12th of October 1944. Six weeks later came the first of many B-29 attacks on Japan from the Marianas. These were carried out at high altitude, but bad weather and marauding fighters meant that although some damage to the waning Japanese munitions industry was caused, the overall results were disappointing, with a number of B-29s being shot down or damaged beyond repair. In January 1945, 21st Bomber Command, operating from the Marianas, received a new commander, General Curtis LeMay, who had won his spurs with the 8th Air Force in Britain. To make the bombing more effective, he decided to go for low-level raids by night, using incendiary bombs. The first of these was mounted against Tokyo on the night of the 9th-10th of March, 1945. It was devastating. Thanks to the largely wooden construction of the houses, a firestorm was created many times worse than that suffered by Hamburg some 20 months earlier. Over a quarter of the city was totally destroyed. Similar raids on other industrial cities followed, before LeMay literally ran out of incendiaries. After the capture of Iwo Jima in March 1945, Mustangs were able to escort the bombers by day. By mid-July, every Japanese city was devastated, and industry had ground to a halt. For the first time, some in Japan began talking about peace. But the military was still in power, and enough people were determined to fight on until the bitter end. Faced with the prospect of awesome casualties that invasion of Japan might bring, the Allies resolved to use a new weapon. On the 6th of August 1945, the B-29 called Enola Gay took off from Tinian in the Marianas. It was armed with the first operational atomic bomb, called Little Boy. The target was Hiroshima, near the southwestern tip of Japan's main island of Honshu. The bomb detonated 2,000 feet above the city and literally flattened over 40 square miles of it. 3 days later, another B-29 dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki, with equally devastating results. It was enough. On the following day, Emperor Hirohito broadcast to his people for the very first time. He told them that Japan would accept the Allied surrender demands. Thus it seemed that those who had preached the power of the bomber to win wars on its own had been finally proved to be correct. Yet it was the weapon, and not the bombers themselves, that had finally proved decisive. And the shadow of the nuclear weapon lies over us to this day.